I'm Nazneen Kane in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminology at Randolph-Macon College. And we wanted to welcome all of our visitors. I think we have visitors here with us from near and far, and also welcome students, faculty, staff, and of course, our wonderful panelists, Ryan Parsons, J. Michael Ryan, and Deborah Cohan, who we're so privileged to hear from today. In the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, the billionaire class increased their wealth by 15% and much more since then, as millions of Americans filed for unemployment, missed rent and mortgage payments, and food assistance demands soared. Seeing the need for social science scholarship on the topic, Dr. Ryan, who is with us today, galvanized a group of scholars to explore various aspects of the pandemic in a 2-volume book series on COVID-19. So not just 1 volume, but Ryan pulled together 2 volumes during COVID-19 on COVID-19, which is really phenomenal. Each of our panelists contributed to the volumes, and of course, Dr. Ryan edited and published the work with Routledge, which was released in late 2020. Today, we're going to hear from each of them. Ryan Parsons on inequality, Dr. Ryan on justice, and Dr. Cohan on the art of letting go and how to move forward in these times of grief and precarity. If you're at all interested in the volumes, I do have coupon codes that I can give you at the end of the webinar, or just email me and I'm happy to send those out to you. The webinar is hosted by the Honors Program at Randolph-Macon College, which is directed by Dr. April Marchetti and Dr. Sarah Krebs. And I thank them so much for their time and organizing skills and support. It's hosted by RMC's chapter of Alpha Kappa Delta, which is our Sociology Honors Society. So Tara Leek, who is an RMC senior majoring in sociology and is both an RMC honors student and an AKD student, will now introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Kane. Our first panelist is Ryan Parsons, a PhD candidate in sociology and social policy at Princeton University, with interests in race and ethnicity, stratification, and rural sociology. Originally from South Mississippi, he is currently conducting fieldwork in the Mississippi Delta as part of a multi-year ethnographic study of barriers to upward mobility in persistently poor rural communities. Prior to arriving at Princeton, he worked in community development in Mississippi and Southwest China. Our second panelist is Dr. J. Michael Ryan, an assistant professor of sociology at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. He has previously held academic positions in Portugal, Egypt, Ecuador, and the United States of America. Before returning to academia, Dr. Ryan worked as a research methodologist at the National Center for Health Statistics in Washington, D.C. He is the editor of multiple volumes, including COVID-19, Global Pandemic Societal Responses and Ideological Solutions, which was published in 2021, COVID-19, Social Consequences and Cultural Adaptations, which was also published in 2021, Trans Lives in a Globalizing World, Rights, Identities, and Politics, published last year in 2020, Gender in the Middle East and North Africa, Contemporary Issues and Challenges, also published in 2020, and Core Concepts in Sociology, published in 2019. He is also the series editor of the COVID-19 Pandemic Series for Routledge Publishers. Dr. Ryan was awarded the 2020 Choice Outstanding Academic title for his co-edited collection, Gender in the Middle East and North Africa. Our third speaker, Deborah J. Cohan, is an associate professor of sociology at the University of South Carolina, Beaufort. Alongside her many academic publications, she is the author of a popular blog entitled Socialites for Psychology Today. She is also the author of Welcome to Wherever We Are, a memoir of family, caregiving, and redemption, published in 2020. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming our panelists, and we will begin with our first panelist, Ryan Parsons.
Thanks, Tara. And I just wanted to let everybody know while Ryan's pulling up his presentation that you are welcome to use the discussion, the Q&A feature and the chat feature to input questions for our panelists. They're really excited to have a conversation with you at the end.
Great. Well, thank you again to Professor Kane for the invitation to be here and to Tara for that introduction. Um, and as Tara mentioned, my kind of overall research agenda focuses on barriers to mobility, especially in the rural, predominantly Black communities of the American Deep South. I moved down to Sunflower County in the Mississippi Delta in the summer of 2018, and I was about halfway through my planned field work when the first case of COVID-19 was reported there. Since then, more than 10% of the population has had COVID, and 2 out of every 1,000 people has died. And African Americans have been disproportionately impacted. So I wrote the chapter that many of you may have read last summer when the pandemic was just starting. Obviously, we've been through a lot since then. Sunflower County has been no exception. Um, and as a rough outline for today, I'm going to kind of quickly orient you to Sunflower County and how the pandemic has unfolded here. I'll kind of remind you of what my original argument in that chapter was, and then talk a bit about some ongoing research about the impact of the pandemic on education, in particular public education um, in this county. And I'll wrap up with some kind of general thoughts about broader implications, but I do want to emphasize this is very much work in progress as the pandemic is very much still impacting lives here and elsewhere. A bit about Sunflower County. So here it is in a map of Mississippi, kind of in the middle of the Mississippi Delta region, which is the northwest quadrant of the state. It has a population of about 25,000, with 80% Black, and 30% of the population lives in poverty. It's been persistently losing population since World War II and has been persistently poor kind of throughout its history. There's basically no major industry at this point. Farming is a big part of the landscape, of course, but most farm work is mechanized, and so very few people are actually employed by farms. And I could talk more about the county if there's interest, but I want to move on to kind of some facts about the pandemic locally. So this is a graph of case rates per 100,000 people for the state of Mississippi. And you can see that there was a first peak in late summer and then a second wave for second peak during the holiday season. Um, the orange line is Mississippi again. The blue line is case rates for Sunflower County. And you can see that the intensity of the pandemic has been worse here um, because of sort of poor infrastructure and then just sort of general problems with poverty and underdevelopment. The third comparison is between Sunflower County, which is the blue line again, and the New York City metro area, which is the orange line. And I wanted to call attention to the way that sort of national narratives diverged from what was happening on the ground. So New York had its first peak in April. This is maybe, it's been a long time, but you might remember this is when Governor Cuomo's daily press conferences were a big thing. This is when people were clapping on the front steps every evening. But at that point, there was basically no pandemic yet in the Deep South. But this is also when, you know, kind of a lot of the lockdown orders were imposed. This is when the first economic impact state payment or the stimulus went out. And so there's a pretty significant divergence between sort of the national response to the pandemic and what was happening locally. So by the time the summer rolled around and cases got really bad in Mississippi, there was basically no meaningful policy response to prevent the spread locally. Um, so if you read, you know, kind of that chapter that I wrote, my original argument at that point was basically that by relying on blanket policies that don't account for spatial inequality, we're running the risk of exacerbating these inequalities, which are already being exacerbated by the pandemic itself. Um, Obviously, again, a lot has happened since then, but I think this trend is still true where these sort of blanket policies are kind of, by failing to, you know, take into account local disparities, are making them worse. Um, so let's talk a bit about schools. That's kind of the focus of this particular talk. So schools closed completely last spring break in March, and students just never came back to school. There was no online learning, no assessment, no contact with teachers, nothing. The school year just ended abruptly. The initial plan for this fall was to offer parents two choices. The first choice was an online only model, but parents would have to provide their own technology. Students would have no interactions with teachers. This was going to be purely passive online learning. The second choice was a hybrid model in which students would come to campus 2 days a week, have asynchronous online education the other 2 days, and Fridays would be reserved for in-person learning for students who needed extra support. So if that online option that I just described sounded punitive to you, you weren't alone. Throughout the late summer, there were protests around Sunflower County um, about the risks, posed by the hybrid model, but also the kind of burden of having to provide technology access in a very poor part of the country. So this is a small protest in a park. Um, it's about half teachers, half parents, and they were raising concerns about kind of both of these issues, the disparate risk and the disparate financial impact that this plan was going to have on students and families and teachers. Um, and to kind of demonstrate kind of the absurdity of this plan, this is the protesters with a rope that has 6 feet segments marked off, and they stretched it out to show how difficult proper social distancing would be in sort of a physical classroom environment. So late in August, in response to these protests, the district shifted to a new plan where they would do everybody online all the time, and they would provide technology with federal funding. But the catch is that they didn't actually get this technology in until early November. And so in the meantime, students who couldn't provide their own technology had to do these packets of worksheets every week, while their more privileged peers were able to kind of log in to Zoom classes like normal. So to get a sense of how this program was impacting students and families in Sunflower County, I worked with a couple of kids that I knew and gave them audio recorders so that they could do interviews with themselves, with their family members, with their siblings about how school was going. And I could sort of get a window into their lives without, creating risk through physical in-person contact. And so for the fall semester, I would periodically get recordings from these kids about how school was working, just to kind of show what this pressure was like. And I won't read all these quotes in the interest of time, but one of the mothers that I met at this protest just already had problems with the schools. She was worried they were teaching too much to the test. And so she would buy supplemental materials, flashcards, games that she could do with her kids to kind of make up for what she thought was lacking in the schools. And on the right there is a text message conversation I had with her son. Um, his mother was the first person he interviewed with his new recorder, and he texted me that night to say, I talked to my mom. It hurts me to see her cry. She was feeling a lot of pressure to make sure her kids were getting the education that they needed. And she tried to hide that from him, but he was pretty perceptive. It wasn't all that serious. The same kid interviewed his little sister, and he was looking for things to talk about. So we asked her about her favorite music. And this is when the Cardi B song WAP came out. So that's what they talked about for a second. And she's in 5th grade, but the song had a big impact on everyone. Another young man that I worked with named Dante interviewed his little sister. At this point, the sister was doing packets because they didn't have enough computers for the whole family. And she says here, and again, I won't read the whole thing in the interest of time, but that she liked doing Zoom school better. She liked having interaction with her friends, with her teachers. She liked having the ability to say what was and was not giving her trouble and to ask questions. And so, students were really missing the impact or the interaction that they got even on a Zoom sort of format. Um, the other thing to note here, this is a very poor family. They were able to get 2 computers from a nonprofit, but there were 4 children. So at this point, Dante and his brother were doing online Zoom school, and his 2 sisters were doing packets because they didn't have enough data from their cell phone plan to have all 4 kids online at once. And so they would periodically switch who was doing these worksheets and who was doing Zoom school. Zoom school, wasn't too much better. And again, I won't kind of read through all of this, but I asked the kids to record what was going on when they were in Zoom school to see get some sort of passive audio to see what this was like. This will be a familiar story, I imagine, to many of you who have been doing online learning this year, but the teachers spent about 5 minutes trying to get a video working so they could do a kind of bell ringer or kind of warm-up activity. For 5 minutes, the teacher realized it wasn't working, and so she tried to create a discussion question on Canvas, which is similar to Blackboard. And after about 3 minutes of silence, she's asking about it, and the kids are like, "Oh, well, I don't see the question And they went back and forth about whether the question was properly posted before giving up. And so they spent about a fourth of their class period on this aborted activity. And this was about halfway through the semester. So the challenges of juggling all these different platforms were not something that they resolved, after a few weeks of practice. They persisted all semester. Last anecdote that I want to share, and this was something that was in the chapter that was published. So I've been working with a nonprofit that does after school tutoring and college prep in this county. And after school has ended last March, the nonprofit tried to continue programming online through Zoom. And so during a college counseling session, I had a private sort of Zoom chat with a student named Ashley, who is set to go to a flagship university in the state. And I was asking her a bit about her financial aid situation. She had a 20 on the ACT, which I thought should qualify her for a need-based scholarship offered through the state that would cover everything. And then it turned out that her GPA had dropped from a 2.5 to a 2.47 because she was failing an earth sciences class. And basically what that meant is that instead of getting this full scholarship, she only got the Pell Grant. She had to go to a different school that she thought was going to be cheaper, but she took out loans and eventually dropped out due to pressures at home and from being too far away from family. And really, what this boils down to is that because her school year ended so abruptly, she wasn't able to pull up this grade from a 2, and she wasn't able to pull up her GPA from a 2.47 to a 2.5. And the result was, tens of thousands of dollars in debt, plus sort of a suboptimal sort of educational sort of matching situation. So a really small thing had an enormous impact. And that's kind of where I want to leave the conversation. We know that there's an extensive literature in sociology about the role of education and reproducing class and racial disparities. And I think what we're going to see next year and in 5 years and 10 years is that the pandemic has created so many of these small vectors of inequality. And it's going to be really important to keep our eyes on how this inequality is being reproduced, and also thinking a bit about the sort of interventions that we're going to have to make, not just right now, but also in a year, in 5 years, and 10 years. The pandemic isn't over, and even when it is over, it's not really going to be over. And so I'll leave it there, and I'll be happy to take questions in the Q&A in a bit. But thank you so much again for the invitation and for your time.
Thank you, Ryan. We will turn now to Dr. J. Michael Ryan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Nazneen, for organizing this, and to RMC for hosting the event today. I'm very happy to be here. I really enjoyed Brian's talk. I'm looking forward to Deb's and also to getting to interact with the audience a bit at the end. So thank you for organizing this and for having me. So with that said, let me dive into my talk for today, which is titled The COVID-19 Pandemic, Consequences and Opportunities. And let me start by saying that I'm a sociologist. And as any good sociologist, I tend to see the dark side of things. The inequalities, the inequities, the discrimination, the prejudice. It's just what I'm trained to do. And the last year has provided me, it's really provided us, with no shortage of opportunities to explore these dark angles. And so that's where I'm going to begin, with the negative consequences of the pandemic. I will, however, and something that's a bit uncharacteristic for me, turn to a bright side towards the end. So it won't be all doom and gloom, but I do want to start with the doom and gloom. So I won't be able to talk about all of the negative social, cultural, political, psychological, the list goes on, consequences today. That's a topic, as Ryan was just mentioning, that would take much longer than the time that we have today. It's going to take much longer than the time we'll have in the coming weeks or months or years. In fact, I completely agree with Ryan that this is an area that we're just starting to learn about. And I think we're going to see the real fallout of the pandemic, in addition to what's already happened, coming in the next couple of years. So this is going to be an ongoing area of study. That said, I want to drop a couple of nuggets about some of the negative consequences and then move into two particular issues that I want to focus on. So some general tidbits. So far, more than 1.5 billion learners have missed out on some part of their education. Those are students at all levels, also adult learners. There's been a drastic increase in reported mental health problems. Food insecurity has risen sharply in many countries. We've seen increasing lines at food banks and other assistance centers, just for people to be able to get a minimal caloric intake to stay alive. And even with that assistance, many people haven't met that goal. We've seen reported cases of domestic violence have risen as people have been locked down and locked together, and stress levels have risen. Another interesting note, I think, is how public and private spaces have come to be merged. So our homes have become our offices, have become our classrooms. So what used to be our refuge from the outside world, our homes, has now been lost, at least for those of us lucky enough to lose it in the first place. So I'm not going to dwell on all of those issues. I just wanted to toss them out, but I do want to focus specifically on issues of economic inequality and digital inequality. So starting with economic inequality, this is a topic that we've all already heard a lot about. In fact, it's probably the issue that we've heard the most about. An estimated 150 million additional people have been pushed into poverty. It's the first time in more than a decade that that number has gone up. In the US alone, an estimated 8 to 10 million additional, and I think that's a key word here, additional people have been pushed below the poverty line. That's upsetting, to put it mildly. But what really adds salt to the wound, I think, is that while millions, really hundreds of millions have gotten poorer, dozens, or maybe hundreds, have gotten extremely, extremely wealthier. So Jeff Bezos, for example, has increased his personal wealth over $100 billion since the pandemic began. Mark Zuckerberg isn't far behind. And the real winner, if we can think of winners now, is Elon Musk, who started the pandemic worth about $35 billion. And now, depending on where the price of Tesla stock is at any given moment, is worth about $200 billion. So his personal worth has increased $160 billion during a global catastrophe at a time when we've seen 160 million additional people pushed into poverty. So when people are talking about how the economy is failing, I think what they also need to pay attention to is that the economy is doing splendidly for a few. And rather than think of the economy as suffering, I suggest we reorient to think about how the economy is becoming increasingly unequal. A less talked about issue is that of digital inequality. Ryan was talking a lot about this as well, and I think it's a particularly important issue to think about as it's become the primary coping mechanism for those of us who've been able to better weather the pandemic and have access to a knowledge of how to use digital outlets. It's what allowed many people around the world, not enough, but many, to continue working, to continue studying, to have virtual visits with doctors, receive financial assistance, be entertained, stay in touch with loved ones. It's been a literal lifesaver for many people. The internet, however, is an unequal thing, and it's a thing that can make other things unequal. I like to think in metaphors, and I sort of think of the internet as the rose with many thorns in the pandemic garden. So it's something that's good, but something that has a lot of negatives as well. A statistic I throw out in class that often shocks my students, it shocks me as well every time I repeat it, that it wasn't until 2017 that even half of the world's population had access to the internet, meaning just 4 years ago, half of the people on the planet didn't have access. Even at the end of 2019, there were an estimated 3.6 billion people that were still offline. Now, that number is likely striking to many of us who spend the majority of our days and our nights connected. It should also be noted that there are deeper inequalities buried in those numbers. So while many parts of the world are nearing internet saturation, in Europe, for example, about 83% of people are online, other parts of the world are lagging far behind. In Africa, only about 28% of people are online. The lack of internet connectivity resulted in people losing possibilities to continue employment, education, having access to news, staying in touch with loved ones, all the benefits I just mentioned. And even for those who could use the internet in some capacity, there were issues of broadband, reliable connectivity, especially with strained networks, and open access to information. And then there are even more issues like language. The vast majority of internet sites are in English, and the vast majority of those that aren't are in other dominant global imperial languages, Spanish, French, Russian. So even someone who has full connectivity and savvy to use the internet, but they only speak Swahili or Quechua, they were limited in their ability to take advantage of digital connectivity as a coping mechanism. And there are still more inequalities buried in there. For example, globally, only 48% of women use the internet, while 58% of men do. We can look at racial inequalities in the US. As of 2015, about 80% of whites and Asians had access to the internet, while only about 70% of Blacks and Hispanics did. So much like economic inequality, I think it's important to understand how digital inequality has also impacted the world and done so in heavily unequal ways. One of the social consequences, though, that we shouldn't forget, and one that really doesn't make the headlines, is our opportunity to act and our opportunity to care. And that's where we can start to link consequences to opportunities. And that's where I want to turn my attention now. Now, I said at the beginning that as a sociologist, I tend to be a pessimist and see the dark side of things, and that's definitely true. But in this case, I also think that there's an opportunity to potentially see some light. It's just up to us whether we want to create that light or not. So one thing that's happened is now there has been greater public awareness to many issues that weren't getting the attention that they deserved before. Issues like mental health. Now, mental health is an issue that had been gaining some ground in recent years, but we're having more discussions about it, more fruitful discussions about it. The question of seniors, right? For a long time, we just sort of locked seniors away and forgot about them, but now there's at least some discussion around those issues. There are also examples of some positive social movements that have arisen as a response to the pandemic. For example, a phone bank has been set up in the UK to call specifically LGBT seniors, because we know that LGBT seniors are more likely to be alone and not have outside social contacts. There have been fundraisers by individuals and celebrities like Lady Gaga and the One World concert. We've seen, this is something that's really growing lately, groups of people coming together to protect Asian-owned businesses and Asian individuals as they've become increasingly under attack. There were community mask-making initiatives. And as loath as I am to give billionaires any credit, even some of them have shown signs of increased social awareness. So for example, Mackenzie Scott, who's Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, has donated more than $6 billion to pandemic-related causes. I would also note she's made $32 billion during the pandemic, but she has donated $6 billion back. So while the consequences have been bad, the opportunities to act on those consequences has been an opportunity to do some good. I also want to take a moment and talk specifically about vaccines, since that's probably the COVID-19 related topic, probably on lots of people's minds at this moment. While the virus was spreading rapidly around the globe, and in the days when there was still no vaccine, the dominant narrative was that we're all in this together. It seemed, with a big emphasis on seemed, that there was some sense of a strengthened global consciousness and awareness of just how closely interconnected we all are. But then came the vaccines, and then it all changed. There's a saying that I like, and I'm paraphrasing it a bit here, but it's something like, it's easy to be a socialist until you hit the lottery. And I think that metaphor is quite fitting for the vaccine situation in the world today. Many of the countries who've been the loudest cheerleaders for a sense of a global social have suddenly, or maybe not so suddenly, become the leading culprits of vaccine nationalism. Canada, for example, has long been seen as a champion of the idea of a we're all in this together mentality. But now that vaccines are available, they've already bought up more than 5 times the necessary doses to vaccinate their entire population. And they're not alone. In fact, rich countries, which account for about 14% of the global population, have already snatched up more than 50% of global vaccine availability. So while the virus doesn't know borders, it seems that vaccines most definitely do. But vaccinations aren't over yet. In fact, they haven't even begun in many parts of the world. So there is still an opportunity to act if we choose to. And that brings me to my concluding thoughts. I think it's a stretch to talk about a silver lining during the pandemic. I feel a little guilty even using that term, especially for people who've contracted the virus, who are suffering from it, who've lost someone close to them, who've suffered from mental or financial issues, and I count myself in this population. But I think there can be, and again, I want to put a big emphasis on can, an opportunity here to bounce back stronger, better, more individually and socially aware. I think what the post-pandemic world will look like is anybody's guess. I'm certain that inequalities are going to continue. I'm certain that we're going to see new forms of inequality that have yet to emerge. But I also think we're seeing opportunities to ameliorate some of those inequalities. I'm slow to be an optimist. Remember, I am a sociologist. But I do see hope here. And I think the key to that hope is in remembering. And remembering is not something that human beings have ever been especially good at, but I think it's something that's really important here. We need to remember when the pandemic was over, what it was like to feel lonely and reach out to people who still are. We need to remember what it was like to face food insecurity, financial insecurity, and reach out to help people who are still in that situation. We need to remember what it was like to not be able to go to work, to not be able to continue our education, and to do what we can to help people who are still in that situation. I think the key is to carry forward with some renewed sense of activism, of social justice, most importantly of social awareness. So sometimes, I think oftentimes really, it takes a disaster to bring about social awareness of an issue and to start some kind of a movement to ameliorate it. The nuclear disaster at Chernobyl was a big push for the anti-nuclear movement. The murder of George Floyd has been a big push to recent racial justice movements. The two world wars were a big push to bring about this idea of a global society, this idea that we're all in it together, and led to the formation of the United Nations. So to go back to metaphors, sometimes a phoenix really can rise out of the ashes, but only sometimes. Whether that happens now or not is entirely up to us. This could all end in even greater tragedy, greater disaster, more inequalities, or it could end with an increased sense of social and global awareness, a realization that we're not on this planet alone, either as individual human beings or as a human species. It could end with a greater sense of social justice. Where this ultimately all plays out is our decision, and again, as loath as I am to be an optimist, I do hope that we make the right one. So I look forward to your questions during the discussion.
Thank you, Mike. So many great insights there. We will turn now to Deb. And I just want to remind people that you can insert your questions into the Q&A or the chat feature. And you don't have to wait. You can do that as they come into your brain.
Okay, thanks, Nazneen. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Okay, great. So thank you so much for organizing this, Nazneen, and putting this together. It's no small feat. And special thanks to Mike O'Brien for making this even possible, that we have this book to have this conversation about. And I think that what he was saying is so relevant, the idea that, the phoenix can rise up from the ashes. I mean, that's exactly kind of how this book really came about, and how even today that we're all together here, that this kind of individual and collective crisis on every level can give way to, to take it a step further, to art making, to creativity, to the sorts of kinds of connections and conversations that are happening here that we might otherwise not have had it not been for this. So so for that, I'm deeply grateful. I'm excited to have a conversation with you. I don't want to talk on and on because I'd really like to hear, it's such a robust audience. And so I'd love to hear your questions and talk with you a bit more. My work is all about relationship building and things like that. So I just want to take you back for a moment. I'm going to talk more story, so and even some poetry. So it's more of like a creative sociology is what I'm doing here. So there's not going to be any PowerPoint on mine, but I just want to take you back to February 14th of 2020, Valentine's Day, right? For me, it was basically one of the most joyous days of my life. It was the date that my first book was released. And that book is Welcome to Wherever We Are, a memoir of family, caregiving, and redemption. And this was a life dream, to publish a book I haven't done as many as Michael. That was absolutely daunting when I heard all the titles mentioned that he's done. Wow. I'll get there eventually. But this book was, or it is, a sociological memoir. You can find it on Amazon. It's been reviewed all over. And it's, I'm excited about it because I'm standing at the intersection in the book of dealing with domestic violence and also dealing with caregiving. And so I grapple with the relationship that I had with my father, who died 3 weeks after I moved to South Carolina from Boston, knowing no one, to take this job as a professor here. And that was in 2012. He had been sick since 2004. So for 8 years as an only child, with my mother having divorced my father at age 65, and about to be 65, and he was 72 years old, I was sort of catapulted into this caregiving role for him. He was a man who was absolutely adoring and absolutely abusive. He was both. I love him. I miss him every single day. But I have these two realities that I hold. This man who cared for me affectionately and loved me, like, as they say, to the moon and back. And I knew that, and I know that. But I also know, and I knew his level of cruelty and what he was capable of saying and doing. You know, he said to me at one point, my life would be easier if you committed suicide. He called my mother, can we swear on this? I don't know, I guess if it's in context, right? It's what he said. I mean, I wish it wasn't. You know, he called my mother at her 60th birthday party in front of my then boyfriend, who became my husband, who's now my ex-husband and a dear friend of mine. So I have certainly this storied history with him, but all this other memory and times of his great affection and his care. So I was juggling these two kind of contradictory realities, if you will. And also at the same time, I spent, you know, well over a decade counseling abusers. And I did that at the first intervention program in the nation in Boston. And I did it through graduate school and beyond. And I also am a trained sociologist studying about patterns of behavior. So I use those two professional experiences to inform this very intimate personal memoir. So that was what was happening for me. In February of 2020, I was launching this book. On February 15th, I got onto an airplane and I was off to start a national book tour. And I was excited. I was off to Chicago, Madison, Wisconsin, Cleveland, Ohio, on and other places planned as well. Then March 15th happened. It ended up being my very last in-person book event in Spartanburg, South Carolina. It had been the very first event I had planned to do. I was invited to do it in September of 2019. I had been looking forward to this for so long. It wound up being a very modified event because people were getting nervous with the pandemic. And I was, you know, 4.5 hours away from home, wondering if there was enough toilet paper at my house when I got there. Now we're hunting for vaccines the way we hunted for toilet paper. Craziness, constant sense of scarcity when we should have a sense of abundance. So this was all happening in February and March for me. And I was already kind of dealing with this narrative of my own life, which was about letting go of my father who died, but also letting go of this abuse history, because I had also, the good news is I had really moved on. You know, I got divorced, I fell in love, I am in love, you know, I've healed so much and my life is different. You know, that's the story of the book, is a story of, you know, kind of coming to some light and some humor and healing and all of that. So it's not all dark and depressing, trust me. It can't be, you know, because for those of you, and there's so many people out there, and there's probably so many people who've survived domestic violence because it is so damn common. But what I can say is it's not a death sentence unless someone murdered you. Really. I mean, I know people who have been murdered through domestic violence. But if that didn't happen, it's not a death sentence and healing is possible. I'm here to tell it. So, you know, when I came back to this shutdown on March 15th, I drove back home, literally trying to find toilet paper on my way home. And then on March 16th, our university had a meeting, an update about what was going on and what was planned. And my provost, and all of his wisdom, said that we would be having school probably starting in April again, that, you know, we're going to go back. Meanwhile, I'm like, dude, we're not going back until maybe next spring, but I know we're not even going to be back in the fall. It was very obvious to me, having been in other parts of the country that month, the world was narrowing. Things were closing down. Things were shutting down. So that's exactly what happened. And, you know, sort of fast forward a little, he's making all these plans. They're telling us all the things that they want us to fixate on and focus on. We're hearing about how we're going to have to teach. And then we start hearing about the language of high flex, which, if you don't know about high flex, please Google it. But all of this big fetishization on methods, on how we were going to deliver content to students, because we have to keep butts in seats. That was the message, right? Well, I had to take a step back. And so what I do in that moment is I write. And so I sat down and I crafted an article that got published in Inside Higher Ed that was all about this whole idea of pandemic pedagogy and what to focus on and, you know, kind of what to let go of. Well, it turned out there was incredible reception to this, because obviously with people so stuck and kind of fixated, I was articulating something that was giving people a sense of spaciousness and a sense of permission to just say, you know what, now's not the time for that. Now's the time for something else. And I thought I was sort of by myself in this, and I was kind of worried that people were just going to push back on it, but instead they opened to this other way of thinking about it. And that was really special. And so, you know, and I got some real wonderful reception from other provosts, presidents of colleges, sending it out to their faculty. It was resonating. So that was really good. And then I saw this call for book chapters with Michael Ryan's book. And so the my chapter in the book is kind of a tweaking and deepening and expanding of what I had done in that article. What occurred to me as I was writing the chapter for this book is how the themes of my my book were sort of ever present in how I was thinking about pandemic pedagogy, and the themes of you know, meditating on what we hold on to, what we let go of, how we remember other people, how we're remembered. That was prominent in the book. It's prominent in how I think about teaching and learning, how we deal with things like grief and loss, and just this absolute unpredictability that we're all navigating. And how do we still kind of cultivate joy? You know, I'm always talking about this with my students. Because ultimately, I think as educators, we have a responsibility to help students live a better life. You know, that's part of this, right? So you know, writing the book, talking about the book, and talking about my life experience definitely shows me that nothing is all good in the world and nothing is all bad. Even abuse, even recovering from abuse, and even the pandemic teaching and learning. So I was always a very scathing critic of online teaching and learning. And I find myself now, like the aperture's opened. I see it in a different way. I see it as a really good enough way to do things to keep us safe. And so I have really embraced it and had a lot of transformative moments with students with it. So the narrative, that I help to illuminate in the book is one of, things are always blended. Nothing is really absolute black and white. And that's so true right now with teaching. Last couple of things I can say about the book that kind of reverberate into this issue with teaching and learning is that the book is so focused on, how do we make ourselves whole? And that is also the focus of my teaching explicitly. It always has been, but even more so now in a pandemic where I teach a lot of students of color who have actually, lost relatives and friends to this deadly virus. So, it's definitely a social justice issue and one that I talk about with my students. And then, lastly, the book is, a meditation, if you will, on what is home. What does home mean? How do we grow up in our homes? How do we feel creative in our homes? Purposeful. And then sometimes how are we stifled in our homes or trapped? And for me, the classroom is another kind of a home. It's a place where I have always found a lot of hope and where I try to, chart that course with and for students. And so, I see this, it's kind of an amazing thing how much the themes of the book really do, they've sort of mirrored how I'm thinking about teaching and learning. So I suppose with that, I'm just going to, do I have one more minute? I guess, okay. I think what I'll do is share with you a poem that has really inspired me. I had a couple, but I'm not gonna do that. I'm just gonna, I'm gonna read, actually, I think I'm inspired to do this one instead because it's not as widely known. So this is called Fire by Judy Brown. What makes a fire burn is space between the logs, a breathing space. Too much of a good thing, too many logs, packed in too tight, can douse the flames almost as surely as a pail of water would. So building fires requires attention to the spaces in between as much as to the wood. When we are able to build open spaces in the same way we've learned to pile on the logs, then we can come to see how it is fuel and the absence of fuel together that make fire possible. We only need to lay a log lightly from time to time. A fire grows simply because the space is there, with openings in which the flame that knows just how it wants to burn can find its way. So I guess I chose that also because it's just, I didn't expect Michael to talk about the phoenix rising up from the ashes, but I guess we're on fire here, right? He and I are often in sync, so this is a perfect way to deal with that. But the thing about this poem is that I was going to say is that, I was really, and I still am, responding to this crazy fixation on methods and on content that I see on teaching pages, on social media, that I see in meetings, that I see coming from our administration, other administrations nationally. And to me, it's just a mistake that what we really need to think about is this issue of how to create a fire that burns in our students forever for lifelong learning, and a way to create space where there's a sense of processing all of what is happening right now. So I think I'll conclude there and then let this be the time that, Q&A and discussion can happen. But thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. It was quite enjoyable. I like hearing that I'm not the only sociologist with the doom and gloom outlook, but I also liked hearing Deb's more optimistic view, which is quite rare among sociologists. So that's a joy. So across the three of you, one of the things that I pulled out are conversations around existing inequalities and how COVID-19 exacerbated some of those. And so, Ryan, you pulled out how blanket policies don't always work to address local disparities. And so thinking in more nuanced and local particular ways about policies. And Mike, you also brought out thinking about that through digital inequality, so which is often overlooked, especially in the United States, where in higher ed, where we assume people have access. And then Deb, you reminded us ways to find joy and ways to make ourselves whole, even when things feel like doom and gloom and when we're in a place of despair or we're in the middle of it. So a question that I actually received through text message, not through the chat, was around questioning vaccine distributions and thinking about the ways that we have access to vaccine distributions in the United States. It's mostly online signups, which assume that people have some sort of tech savvy skills. It also requires that you have transportation or regular or some sort of access to transportation. And it assumes that you have the time to drive to the site, to sit and wait, come back home, that you have that time and you have the energy. So the emotional energy to do vaccine hunting, right? There are vaccine hunting groups now. So I'm wondering what strategies you all might have when you're thinking through things like inequalities as a result of vaccine distributions or the way that the policies have been implemented so far. If you all have strategies for folks when they start to see those types of inequalities emerge within their local communities. So maybe we can go in order, Ryan, Michael, and then Deb. Easier.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. And one of the, the highest predictors of morbidity for COVID patients is poverty status. And so aside from like health conditions, just being poor makes this virus worse. And so, this is definitely an area where much more targeted outreach would be useful. And that, hasn't really happened locally. It's not happening in much of the United States, from what I can tell. The other kind of dimension to this vaccine inequality is trust. A lot of populations, especially Black Americans, have very valid reasons to be distrustful of public health systems. And so I don't think there's been enough to address either the trust or the access issues. The solution, is just more targeted outreach and the will to do that and sort of set aside other populations in the meantime. But I'm not terribly optimistic that that's going to happen, at least around here.
Yeah, I also think it's a really good question, a really important one that we need to reach some kind of decisions about soon as vaccines are rolling out. I think a big part of how we politicize vaccine distribution, because it's become something that's very highly political, is the level at which we think of how we want to distribute them. So we've seen a tremendous amount of selfishness going on during the pandemic, where it's me, and the toilet paper hoarding and this side of kind of thing. Then, or do we think about it at the level of our home? I care about, my parents and my loved ones, but maybe my neighbor a little less. Do we think about it at the level of our communities? So I care about people around me, even if it's for selfish reasons, because I'm going to be in contact with them. We see in politics people talking about it at state levels. My state wants more, your state has too many. I think globally we see probably what I think are maybe some of the most egregious ways of looking at it in this vaccine nationalism that's emerged. How many vaccines does one country need? Well, theoretically, enough to vaccinate your entire population. Anything above and beyond that is inexcusable. Right? In my mind, that's absolutely inexcusable, and that should be going to somebody else. Whether you should even have enough to vaccinate your entire population, we can maybe have more discussions about. I'll use myself as an example. So I'm in my early 40s, I'm relatively healthy. Should I get the vaccine because I'm from the US and maybe they have more vaccines versus a 75-year-old person with pre-existing conditions who lives in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So I think it's a lot about the level at which we're thinking about how the vaccines are going to be distributed. In terms of, I think another big issue will come when how do we get people to actually take the vaccine once they have access? There's a lot of vaccine hesitancy going on, not just in the US. Places like France, Russia have very high levels as well. That's a more complicated, I think, long-term question, but getting people to rely on science, helping people to understand the difference between information and disinformation and misinformation that we see perpetuated, that not everyone with a Twitter account knows what they're talking about. I think overcoming that sort of mentality will be important so that even once vaccines can be distributed, and assuming we find some way to equitably distribute them, that people will actually put it in their arms. Or if you've been watching the news in recent days, just get Dolly Parton to sing her Jolene song, and that's all the encouragement I need.
Deb, did you want to add anything to that?
No, let's take another question because I feel like that was thoroughly responded to.
Right. Okay. So a student asked that many of the rich countries in Mike, you just mentioned this again, that many of the rich countries are buying up the vaccines, leaving less affluent countries without. And I think we can probably even see some of this happening at the state level in the US. So this student is a political science major, and he's curious about the fact that the goal of government is the collective security of its citizens and to make sure that its citizens are taken care of. So what should countries do? So maybe the question of when is nationalism ever appropriate? And even at the state level, when are kind of one of the things that I've noticed is boundaries around who's eligible within particular states to get vaccines.
I can give a quick reaction. I think if there were an open market for vaccines in the United States, states like Mississippi, Alabama, the poor states would definitely not be as vaccinated as they are today because of that sort of disparity within the country. Obviously, it's happening globally, but not in every situation. I'm thinking about New Zealand that bought surplus vaccine doses for surrounding countries, and if you want to take sort of this approach that governments should only care about their own citizens, obviously this is a global pandemic, and furthering global vaccination efforts are going to make your local country safer too.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was going to say, that the best way for a country to take care of its citizens is to make sure people in other countries get vaccinated as well. A lesson that I hope comes out of this pandemic is that there are no borders when it comes to something like a virus. The virus is not stopping at the border. It doesn't care what state you live in. It doesn't care about your sexuality or your age. It doesn't care, right? It's a virus. So if we start caring and the virus doesn't, there's a problem going on there. We're also seeing that people are traveling, right? Even with these new variants, we're having easier ways of measuring in the ways that we're globally interconnected that maybe we didn't even realize that we were. When a variant from Brazil starts showing up in rural Iowa, that's surprising to me. Maybe it shouldn't be as much globetrotting as they do, but it is. So when we help everyone, that's the best way I think that we can help ourselves, because even if we vaccinate everyone in our own country, people are going to be coming in and out, right? The virus is going to travel.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say something about that, this vaccine tourism that's happening. I live in a tourist area. I live right near Hilton Head, South Carolina, and people descend here for the beach and everything. And we're seeing it now, and we're seeing lots of people who are traveling. I mean, it's Beaufort County, traveling to Beaufort County from all over, the United States, and also getting vaccines here. Now, one of the statistics that's just come out, though, is that we're one of the counties that is having the highest vaccination rate, but we're having the lowest among residents because we can't get them. Now, I'm seeing it just really at such a local level, this inequality. So that's one piece. The other thing that hasn't really been said that I do want to make mention of is that there's this idea that seems to be circulating in the culture and like, you know, and just globally of like this quote, when the pandemic's over, or when we go back to normal, or when we're all vaccinated. But the problem with that thinking is it probably won't happen because there's so much scientific evidence that is showing us that this is not the only pandemic we're likely to live through. So because of the climate crisis and the effects on the environment, and then the connection of humans and animals, where some viruses are not transmitted between humans and animals, but this and others can be. So that's another thing to start to think about. So I guess, you know, Sarah, unfortunately, I'm not all optimism, actually. You know, there's definitely this realism of like, oh my gosh, this could maybe not our first rodeo here. And so even though there's this idea of, oh, well, the Spanish flu happened, you know, early 1900s, and that's a lifetime ago, and this is our chance, and then it's over. I don't know. I think there's so much, it's kind of a capitalist narrative anyway, that's like, when this is over, or when we get to do this, or when I buy that, I'll be happy, or when I get to go there, I'll be happy. And it never works that way. I mean, and so that's kind of why I come back to this, having to find some, you know, peace or wholeness or whatever inside. And that like all the talk about all of that isn't going to change certain things. And so that's, you know, I guess I'm hoping for vaccination solutions and fixing disparity. You know, those solutions need to happen not just for this one moment. They have to be long-term sustainable for decades and decades beyond.
Thank you, Deb. I think that's really, really insightful, and also insightful just to think about how to be in this precarious moment and how to be in it without having all this anxiety about it. Unfortunately, we are at 1:04, so we are all out of time. I wish we could keep going. Before everyone jumps off, I wanted to thank everyone so much for coming and spending time with our wonderful panelists, to thank our panelists for coming. Again, they're coming from near and very far, and also to thank the honors program for all their help with making flyers and organizing everything. If you are interested at all in reading more about, you know, the social science approach to COVID-19 and this pandemic, I did put the title of the 2 volumes, which is COVID-19. Again, there's 2 volumes. They're both edited by J. Michael Ryan, and I put a little coupon code in there. If you would like a flyer, feel free to just send me an email and I'll send it to you. So thank you everyone again so much for coming.